Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julia Wittlin, and I'm very excited to be here today. Apologies, some technical issues. My name is Julia Wittlin, and I'm very excited to be here today. I work in Blackrock's private equity partners team. I've been with Blackrock for 13 years, and I'm a senior investment professional focusing on our impact and our ESG initiatives within the firm. Our group invests across the private equity stack, from growth equity and late stage venture all the way to buyouts. And today I'm very pleased to be here with you today to speak about what we're seeing in the impact investing universe. With that, my colleague will bring the slides up on the screen. But I wanted to share what I think is really interesting about where we sit today in this moment in time. And if you look at slide 2, what you'll see is that together we are all facing very pressing societal challenges. Whether you think about the COVID impact and the COVID situation that we have had this year, impacting everyone globally and what that means for everyone's health and well-being. Whether you think about that less than half the world's population does not have essential health services. You think about climate change, and obviously here in the US, as well as in Europe, Asia, and Latin America, we've seen significant events related to climate. Whether in Texas, it was the winter freeze, in California, the fires, in Asia, the tsunamis that happened. Climate change has obviously come to the forefront of many of us. Resources, so if you think about the amount of garbage that is going to landfills, the use of plastics contaminating our oceans. Education, I think, is an issue this year that has also been brought to the forefront. If you are like me, perhaps you might have young children at home who are not going to school in the traditional way, but more broadly, the lack of education being a challenge for many students around the world. And then financial inclusion. And I would argue that actually these challenges have not only existed in a pre-COVID world, but in many ways, COVID has only exacerbated them and has really brought them to the forefront for many of us. And as we sat here this year and thought about, well, how do we want to think about addressing these challenges? How do we think about the opportunities in private equity? It became very clear to us that there is a way to direct capital to solving these very large challenges, but doing so in a way that actually earns a traditional private equity return without sacrificing that for impact. If we turn to the next slide, I think it's important to delineate Blackrock's approach and how we think about more broadly sustainable investing. And we really believe that it is a continuum. On the far left, you'll see here that we have traditional strategies. So our traditional portfolios that invest across every single sector, all of those portfolios at Blackrock actually are screened. So certain industries and certain companies are excluded as part of our normal ESG practices that we're very proud of. If you take that one step further, we have thematic sustainable strategies. And these are strategies that may identify with a particular sustainable development goal. Again, we delineate this from impact strategies, which is what we're going to talk about on the far right, where this is a strategy that is intentional and focused at investing in key areas of the market to drive not only a private equity return, but also measurable positive impact outcomes. And when I think about why this is particularly important, one of the truest notions in private equity is that you want to invest behind ideas and companies that are solving big problems. So you want your addressable market to be a big market, because often that means that there's multiple ways of focusing on that market and multiple ways companies can try to address those challenges. One of the reasons that we like the impact and private equity strategy is that those problems, because they're large, they also are very much aligned to the type of capital that is private equity. If we turn to the next page, I think it's also important to highlight that there's been very rapid growth in the sustainable private equity market. And I think that's really due to two reasons. One is that obviously the UN has adopted these sustainable development goals, but private investors such as yourselves, myself, government, and other stakeholders have actually started to incorporate sustainability into investment decisions. Blackrock, I think, has been very focused on this, but you'll see this across the board. Companies that you traditionally wouldn't think of as having a view on climate change have actually started to either present data to their stakeholders or seek alternative business models. So, for example, one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world recently bought a chain of electric vehicle charging stations. If that doesn't tell you the world is changing, I'm not sure what does. But the other piece here is that I think investors have also realized that there is the potential for attractive risk-adjusted returns. And I think that's very much a change from 5-10 years ago. It used to be that if you wanted to invest with a lens for social purpose, that investment vehicle was more philanthropic or charity-focused than truly trying to achieve private equity returns. But as more and more of these issues have become addressable through private equity, what we found is that actually the market has expanded. Entrepreneurs have actually been more focused on the type of capital that they take. So they want capital that is aligned to their mission and their vision for a better future. And as a result, if you look on the chart on the left in orange, what you see is that the fundraising dollars that are focused on sustainability has increased substantially. And then when we ask investors, and this is part of a very large investor survey that we do for a number of institutions globally, as you ask those investors, what is their outlook? Will they be increasing their allocation? They've highlighted to us what percentage of their holdings currently have this lens of investing for sustainability today versus where they're going in the future. And I think the point I was making earlier, there are ways in which the market, because of the size of these issues, has actually adopted and adapted to the changing environment. So as an example, education is an area where 5 years ago, we never actually really saw education transactions. If you fast forward to today, one of the fastest growing segments in private equity is the intersection of education and technology. And when you ask yourself, well, what is driving that? That is largely driven by what's happened to COVID and the realization that educational outcomes and access and affordability is a key problem across society. If we turn to the next slide, and then I promise we'll stop flipping slides in a minute. I think it's also interesting to note the evolution of private equity and why it's perfectly married to building impact across industries and geographies. As you know, private equity is a long-term horizon approach to investing, and many of the companies in this space are looking for that long-term partner to drive positive impact. The other piece here is that private equity is active ownership in its truest form. So unlike a public stock that has multiple stakeholders and has very diffused ownership, private equity is a control-oriented asset class where the ability to drive outcomes, the ability to participate on the board is one that is very relevant and allows you to really think about how you drive the business model of the particular company. The other piece that's interesting is obviously investment due diligence and the ability to be selective. We always say that we are looking to invest in markets that are both deep as well as wide. And the reason that that's particularly important is that you want markets that are deep because you want to be able to do investment due diligence, you want to be able to find opportunities that have a private equity return. But you want a market that's wide enough where you're allowed to and have the ability to do relative value between individual asset classes and individual securities, meaning individual companies. And that notion of doing relative values, if I want to invest in education, I can compare investment A versus investment B, is really important because it allows you to have that very high threshold for investing, which ultimately we believe leads to better performance. Intentionality is another area where we feel that being very transparent about what type of capital this is and why you're investing is very important. For background, and it's public information, we're investors in a company called Rivian, which is a electric vehicle company. That company had their choice of investors. And in today's world where valuations are high and there's significant capital in the ecosystem, we're finding that being intentional about what our capital is, that we're investing not only for financial returns, but with purpose, has actually become a competitive advantage. And so when we were working with the CEO and said, we wanted to be an investor and we're working on getting access to the company, part of the reason he chose Blackrock is for our alignment on purpose. And that intentionality, we're finding more and more entrepreneurs have a vision for the future, not only for their company, but the world that they want to see. And they're building a business to tackle a problem that they believe is very important to society. And so that intentionality has become helpful not only from a competitive advantage standpoint, but also in terms of being focused on the goals that we have for the company. And then the last piece that we look for is additionality. So the idea that we could, quote unquote, add something to the company. There's many companies that are out there that they can get capital from anyone, and our capital may or may not be strategic to them. Those are not the types of companies that we want to invest behind. Rather, we want to invest in companies that realize that having BlackRock or having the type of institutional capital that we represent is additive to their business. Whether they're a company, for example, that's based in Latin America, that wants to go international, that needs an international name in their underlying investor base, or whether it's a company that wants to go public one day, and BlackRock, being the world's largest asset manager, can help them on that journey. So these are the 5 attributes that we look for when building an impact strategy, and we think it's really important. With all of that said, as we look at this landscape, we think that there's sort of an interesting inflection point in this point in time. You have the rise of very large, focused private equity investment vehicles that are focused on impact. And then you have very, very small institutions that have raised funds that are sub 200 million that are focused on unique challenges within this space. But when you look at the breadth or the middle component of that ecosystem, it's missing. And so we believe that there's actually quite a bit of investment opportunity here because you have this barbelling effect where you have very, very large investment vehicles and very tiny ones, but really nothing in the middle. And we find that area particularly attractive. The other piece here that I think is important to clarify, which I think is a myth, is that in many cases, there's this view that you have to sacrifice returns. We don't believe that's the case. We actually underwrite our impact transactions to have the same underwriting standards and returns as any traditional private equity investment. And the reason that we believe that's the case is because we have seen the market evolve where these opportunities are very much embedded into the company. Our investment thesis is very simple. We want the driver of financial return to be the driver of impact return so that there is no conflict between sustainability and impact outcomes and revenue generation. So when we think about our investment in Rivian, the more cars that Rivian produces that are electric in nature, the more revenue the company makes. The more cars Rivian produces, the more CO2 or carbon they displace from the environment. So that alignment of interest is critical. And then the last piece I would tell you is really around sourcing and how we find opportunities before we turn it to questions and answers. And what we found here is that by being very public, you may have seen our CEO, Larry Fink's letter, where he's very publicly stated that we are investing on behalf of pension plans, so pensioners, endowments, foundations, and families, and ultimately they are a stakeholder of ours in the long term. And what we found is that intentionality has really led to a number of investment opportunities that we wouldn't have otherwise seen. And we think it's very important that if we could instill perhaps one piece of advice or one item, as food for thought, it's very important that if you're going to invest in this space, the values that you bring to bear are very transparent to everyone so that you do not essentially, run the risk of greenwashing or run the risk of saying that this investment that you've made is a positive for society, and yet, a year later or 2 years later, actually it's a net negative. The last piece I would tell you is I think the challenges that we outlined on the first page, whether it's good health and well-being or climate, I would argue these are not challenges that are going to go away in the next 5 years or 10 years. So when I think about the depth of opportunity, I think this is a space where the market is actually coming to us or acknowledging that these are big issues. 5 years ago, if you had told me that electric vehicles would dominate the traditional vehicles from a market cap perspective, or Tesla would have a market capitalization that is higher than the traditional auto vehicles, I'm not sure I would have believed you. But what's evident is not only is the technology better, so the cars drive better as an example, but actually there's the environmental impact, and also consumers have leaned in. And so it's that combination of the market evolving to recognize these problems can be solved, the investment opportunities that exist, but also consumer and entrepreneur preference that is really resulting in a tailwind in this space. With that, I would be happy to turn it to questions from the audience. Thank you for your time. So one of the questions we've received is around how do we do measurement here? And I think that's a really important one to assess. And from a question perspective, from the measurement perspective, we've actually developed a methodology using IRIS, which is a standard methodology for impact measurement. So that way we will do the measurement ex ante before we invest. So what is our expected target in terms of CO2 displacement, or in terms of clean energy production, or in terms of educational outcomes? And then we will essentially monitor that over our hold period, so that way we are able to then report back to our stakeholders. I think the important piece here with regards to measurement is that there's many different ways in which to measure impact. Some groups prefer an approach that is called an impact money multiplier. Essentially, they take a number of inputs and then say, for every dollar you've invested, you generated X dollars of impact. We have shied away from that approach because we think it's not very transparent. So what we have done instead is actually we have built a reporting framework that in a very transparent way lays out for each of the companies we've invested in what are the key impact drivers and how is the company performing against those. And we submit those reports to our underlying investor base. Let me see if there's any other questions.
No, Julia, we don't have any question. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for your time. And if we can help you in any other way, please let us know.